This is the most exciting GPU launch in an age, and I've got the Sapphire Nitro Plus RX 7800 XT to take a quick look at. Sapphire, yes. So the 7800, if you are not familiar, I did a separate review of the AMD reference version and the launch and all of the stuff around the launch. This is RDNA 3, it has 16 gigabytes of VRAM. This is meant to be a 5-year card, the card that is accessible for a long, long time. Like you buy it and you use it for 2, 3, 4, 5 years. Or, you know, the card that's at the affordable price point, the most performance per dollar price point. That's what this is meant to be. And mostly it delivers. And we'll take a look at that in terms of the benchmarks. In terms of the build and the fit and finish, this feels like a top tier card. Like, you know, the 7800 is sort of the middle of the road card. It's not the least expensive, and it is by far not the most expensive. In fact, you could spend 3 times as much on a GPU that wouldn't deliver 3 times the performance. But it's a large card. It is fully every bit of 3 slots. It also has a 3-slot bracket at the end, which you should be careful of because a lot of the time builds in different cases will make physical accommodations for 2 brackets, even though there is room for 3 brackets worth of stuff, especially if you're using this, in a bottom slot, you're doing a Threadripper build, something like that, and so you're hanging off the end of the motherboard. Things in like the Fractal Define XL case where you've got the extra slot at the bottom, that kind of thing wouldn't work for a true 3-slot bracket. But it does give Sapphire the ability to build in full-length GPU bracket support. They also made their GPU taller. So if you're in a case like the Lee & Lee 011 Dynamic, it can make builds in that case a little more troublesome, but they have recessed the power connector, which is the thing that you usually run into, the problem. And so because the power connector is recessed, even though the card is super tall, it sort of gives you the best of both worlds. It gives you the best shot at this GPU actually working in some of those cases where the motherboard tray depth is not as much, but you know, it is a full 3-slot bracket at the end. Something to consider when you're doing your build. It is a full, metal back plate and metal support. We've also got a GPU anti-sag support bracket built on this side as well. So mechanically, this is a significant chunker of a card. I like that. It actually feels like the Sapphire Toxic, they're sort of their most famous, highest end, ultra premium card. And this sort of feels like a Toxic card from a couple of generations ago, or more than a couple of generations ago. It's a very, very beefy card. We have 3 large and very quiet fans. We've got a little bit of pass-through cooling on the end of the card here, but mostly the card is shorter and thicker. For a 7800 class GPU, again, this is a middle-of-the-road GPU, they're not dumping 600 watts of power into this. This is kind of overkill. I mean, look, we've got 5 heat pipes coming out the end of the heatsink on the end here. This is just madness. But as we'll see in the benchmarks, the madness is perhaps justified. We've also got 2 8-pin power connectors. My favorite thing about this GPU is that you can have a normal power supply in your computer. 700 watts, 750 watts, 800 watts. All of that is fine and will work great with this GPU pretty much no matter what your build is, except for maybe the highest end, Threadripper, or you're doing something off-label. But for just a normal desktop build, I've only got a 700 watt power supply and 2 8-pin connectors. This is the card that can do 60 FPS at 4K even before we get into the whole frame generation upscaling technology stuff. It is a really nice, attractive build. I'll also mention that it does have a BIOS switch, which is awesome if you're a Linux user and you're flashing BIOSes or trying different stuff. You've always got a recovery path as long as you only use one of your BIOSes for experimentation and the other BIOS for recovery. Very nice. We've also got an RGB out header and a fan in header. The display connectors on this GPU are a little unusual. You have 2 HDMI 2.1 and 2 DisplayPort 2.1, so dual DisplayPort, dual HDMI. If wishes were horses, I would have preferred just adding an HDMI so you had 5 connectors, any 4 of which were usable, but hey, it's a 7800 class GPU, and they're trying to make the GPU not cost significantly more than the AMD reference version. As compared with the AMD reference version, this is a physically much larger card. In fact, the reference version of the AMD 7800 is the smallest 7800 that I've seen. It would fit in a lot of very, very small builds, whereas This is basically your high tier GPU from last generation. 3 slots, truly 3 slots, needs cooling, and basically always except power. So something to consider when you're working on your build. This GPU is also an excellent choice for Linux workstations because the extreme maximum overkill and cooling means that this GPU is going to run cool all of the time. Even when you're playing games, the temperatures are really pretty impressive. So let's take a look at the performance. So for Borderlands 3, the name of the game here is to look for improvements over reference. And starting it off at 4K, we're seeing a pattern, a little bit of a pattern, that emerges at 4K but is maybe not elsewhere. So Borderlands 3, it's an older title, and already the 7800 XT Nitro Plus Edition is pulling a little bit ahead in both our 1% lows and our overall average frame rate. Nice job. But we dropped down to 1080p, and while we get a higher average frame rate, something weird was going on, and our 1% lows were significantly lower. Now the 7800 XT reference and the Nitro Plus were tested at different times, and this was after I was troubleshooting an F1 2023 issue, so I think this was because the state of the system was different during the reference card testing and the Borderlands 3 testing. But I didn't have a lot of time with this card, so things have to go on. We saw that at 1440p, so I feel like this is a system-specific issue, and I didn't see this in any other games, so I think this is probably just something down to the system and not anything with the hardware itself. For the Callisto protocol at 4K, 115 FPS, the 1% and 0.1% lows, I mean, that's just Callisto protocol. This is the 4K high preset. Over 100 FPS on a, $500-$600 class GPU at launch. Very impressive. 221 FPS at 1080p with 1% lows staying around 60. 1440p, again, 1% lows sticking pretty close to 60, 180 FPS. 1440p is probably where I would play Callisto Protocol, or 4K at like a medium high as opposed to the high preset. Cyberpunk 2077 at 4K, 84 FPS, very, very respectable, and a very respectable performance bump over the reference editions, just barely outside of margin of error, but the increased clock speed of the Sapphire Nitro Plus is appreciable here. You can get even a little more than this if you're willing to overclock. But these are the out-of-the-box numbers in terms of performance. 193 versus 195, basically margin of error for 1080, and 1440, 143 versus 146. For Firestrike, it does make a pretty significant difference. I mean, 49,000 overall score versus 47,000 for the reference edition. You can tell that Sapphire has done something different with this card over reference. Shadow of the Tomb Raider at 4K, basically within margin of error in terms of differences. 251 versus 245. Okay, at 1080p, I am seeing a little bit of an uplift outside of margin of error. 178 versus 183 at 1440p. Yeah, that's probably down to improvements in the card as well. But it's kind of close. 18,000 versus 19,726. Sapphire's made some improvements to their card. This is a pretty strong showing overall. And there we are. There's the reason that you buy this card. Temperature and noise. We've got a 15 degrees C improvement average over the reference version of this card. And Sapphire doesn't believe in running the card hot because that's just how Sapphire rolls. Now, there's not a huge difference between our hotspot temperatures among the 7800 models that I'm testing, but even that shows a pretty significant improvement over the reference model. But still, how I test this is I run Callisto Protocol for a very, very long time on a benchmark loop, basically because Callisto Protocol is basically on the struggle bus when it comes to the high presets, as evidenced by the 1% lows and everything else. Are we GPU limited? Are we CPU limited? It's kind of a real world gaming test as opposed to an artificial benchmark for your GPU, which is just going to run your GPU at some ridiculous temperature all the time. This card was also surprisingly quiet under this test. If you're playing a game with your desktop, on your desktop, it's going to be much less noticeable in terms of fan noise and everything else over the hum of the rest of your system. Giant heat pipes notwithstanding. Probably something to do with Sapphire design. Sapphire also has one unique software trick up their sleeve called Trixx Boost. A Trixx Boost is a neat technology. I wouldn't exactly call it resolution scaling, but it lets you render the game part of the game, not the HUD part of the game, at a lower resolution and get a performance benefit. But it's not hard and fast. Like, you don't render 1440p and upscale it to 4K. You can render it some in-between resolution between 1440 and 4K. Some games have added this kind of thing natively, but Trixx Boost lets you do this basically with any game. Sometimes with side effects, sometimes not. But generally, Sapphire is doing a pretty good job here making that work for their GPUs. Overall, the verdict here, this is a superior cooling solution. This is probably a 5-year solution in terms of GPU engineering. And a little bit of an overclock out of the box definitely helps at higher resolutions. Lower resolutions not so much because you're probably limited by other things that are going on with the system, but higher resolutions, yeah, for sure, definitely. In general, now and in the past, I've liked Sapphire hardware engineering. This card is no exception. I think they've probably overbuilt it for what the 7800 is. I mean, I get why they made the choices they made, and overall, so far in my testing, it's a pretty solid card. I'm going to try to squeeze in some Linux testing with this card before I have to send it back, because I do think the 7800 series is going to be the everyman enthusiast. Like, I don't want to spend too much money on my GPU, but I kind of want a nice GPU for Linux. And Sapphire generally on Linux, it's been a pretty solid option. But you'll have to wait for another video for that. I'm Wendell, this is Level 1, I'm signing out, and you can find me in the Level 1 forums.